All right, guys, so we got some new leaked polling data that was commissioned by the Israeli government itself that DropSite News was able to get their hands on. And special shout out to DropSite, created by Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill. Their work is pretty much unmatched, at least here in the US, in terms of their coverage on Israel and Gaza. So if you're not subscribed to their Substack, it's completely free to do so. Highly recommend everybody does if you want to stay up to date on everything. But their headline here to start us off on the first report is, according to this leaked polling data, Israel is considered a genocidal apartheid country abroad, according to Israel's own research. So what are they talking about here? They say the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs commissioned an American polling firm to perform a sweeping battery of surveys and focus groups coupled with message testing aimed at rehabilitating Israel's image in both the United States and Europe. The work remains ongoing, but a preliminary report from the firm was leaked to DropSite News by a source with direct access to it. So this polling data that they're obtaining here has the goal of, number one, seeing where people in the US and Europe, obviously the two main coalitions that they need to keep in support of themselves in order to continue this genocide and their apartheid and their ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So let's see where people are. And then number two, what messaging works best to try to change their minds, because we know they're already overwhelmingly against what we're doing. So how can we change their minds in order to get them to support this genocide, right? So that's the purpose of it. And you can see that it's broken down here into multiple phases. Phase one was they did qualitative testing here, 15 focus groups, 6 in the US, 3 in Europe. The European countries that they focused on were the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and also Spain. And then phase 2, moving on here, was quantitative message testing, where they did 8,000 total interviews. Again, most of them in the US, but 1,200 were in the UK, Germany, France, and Spain. This was a starting point. Where are people now? And message resonance and prioritization. And then phase 3, which is where they say they are right now, is animatic testing or preliminary testing to see what messaging works the best in order to try to get people back onto their side. They say the survey asked people in the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom, Spain, and France how many people they believed Israel had killed in Gaza and what portion of those were civilians. Respondents in all of the countries overwhelmingly said that those killed were mostly civilians. And you can see that broken down here by country and also by percentage. So on the left here, we have mostly Hamas terrorists or collaborators have been killed, which is objectively false. There's no possible metric that you could look at the death toll or the casualty rate inside of Gaza and say that a majority of those killed have been Hamas or Hamas collaborators. It's nowhere remotely close to a majority. In fact, a majority of those killed have just been women and children, right? Not to implicate the men, as Israel does, as all military age men are Hamas, but just a majority would be women and children, right? So this is factually inaccurate. So the people in this bracket over here, the 34 to 23% in various countries of the US and inside of Europe, they're wrong. But even then, you have a vast majority in each one of these countries that say that most of the people that Israel is killing are civilians, right? Which is true. So at least a vast majority, I mean, in some of these countries, like here in France, it's all the way up at 77%. In Spain, it's at 76%. In the UK, it's at 75%, say that Israel is killing mostly civilians. Now they continue, they say in the US and Germany, the two countries where the public remains relatively supportive of Israel, according to this survey, the respondents also believe that Israel's campaign has been far less deadly than it has in reality. So the median response in the US and Denmark, estimating the number killed by Israel, was just 10,000. 10,000, as opposed to 30,000 and 40,000 death toll that was estimated in France and Spain, respectively. The current confirmed death toll by the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is certainly an undercount, as they point out here, is over 64,000. So understand what we're looking at here, right? You have lessening support in each one of these countries, whether it's the US or Germany or France or Spain or Denmark or wherever else, increasing rejection and revulsion at what Israel is doing in Gaza. And this is with, according to this survey here, people having a drastic underestimation of the amount of people that Israel has killed, right? In all likelihood, the true death toll is significantly higher than the number that we've gotten from the Gaza Ministry of Health, because the way that the Gaza Ministry of Health calculates their numbers, they're only working with the data that they have at their disposal, right? The people who go through their systems. And we're talking about a healthcare system, a governance system inside of Gaza that has been explicitly targeted and obliterated, right? They've targeted hospitals and doctors and rescue workers and paramedics and civil workers inside of Gaza. So the fact that we can get any count at all in Gaza at this point is a miracle, thanks to the people who are still alive and trying to keep track of this, but it has to be a drastic undercount. In reality, the number is probably well over 100,000, maybe into the hundreds of thousands. And you can see how far off people's estimations are in, France, Spain, the US, etc., by tens of thousands at the very bare minimum, right? And so what does this tell you? Well, it tells you that even though, again, we've seen a drop-off of support for Israel in all of these countries in the US and Europe, it has not hit the floor, right? Because if these people, maybe in the US, for example, who think that only 10,000 have been killed, if they knew that that number was at the very bare minimum over 60,000, I mean, there's been double the amount that they listed here of just children killed. There's been almost 20,000 children confirmed killed. So if they knew that, if they knew that potentially hundreds of thousands had been killed, would their opinion of Israel be even less than where it's at right now, which again is at a historic low already? So again, we have not seen the floor in terms of a rejection of what Israel is doing. Now we move on to the messaging side of this, right? So what does Israel think, according to this survey that was conducted here, is the best strategy to turn people against Palestinians, is really effectively what this is, and more so back on the side of Israel, right? So they say that Israel's best tactic to combat this, according to the study, is to foment fear of radical Islam and jihadism, which remains high, the research finds. They also say, by highlighting Israeli support for women's rights and gay rights, while elevating concerns that Hamas wants to destroy all Jews and spread jihadism, Israeli support rebounded by an average of over 20 points in each country. So their strategy here is to basically push Islamophobic rhetoric in Europe and the US to try to raise the Islamophobic energy in these countries, to say that in Israel, we love the gays and the women because our women are off in tanks doing a genocide in Gaza. Aren't we so progressive for doing that, right? And then the final point there, again, sorry to exit out of this, and the final point there being to say basically that Hamas wants to destroy the world. They want to kill all of the Jews and spread jihadism in a global Islamic conquest or something like that, which is objectively inaccurate. But you look at each of the points broken down in this finding. I mean, again, this is insanity. They say about half of all Europeans were generally misinformed. So this is their opinion, not, objective reality, but they say half of all Europeans were generally misinformed about the state of Israel as a democracy offering freedom of religion and having rights for women and gays. So they think the rest of the world is misinformed about Israel being a democracy. In other words, people around the world don't think that Israel is a democracy, which is true. They're not a democracy. As we saw from the headline in this article, they're an apartheid state, and clearly a huge bulk of the world understands that, right? You cannot be a democracy and also be an ethnocracy, right? You cannot be, or an ethno-state. You cannot be a democracy and an apartheid state. Those are contradictory terms, but they're framing this as people around the world are just misinformed. They don't understand that we are this beacon for freedom and for human rights and for democracy, right? So that's their finding here. They continue. They say, fear of the threat of Islamic jihadism is prevalent throughout Europe. They say Europeans believe that the Hamas casualty numbers are accurate. They're talking about the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers here. They frame it as Hamas. And that mostly civilians were killed, which again is true. That's not a Hamas talking point. It is true that mostly civilians have been killed. They say they agree with the language of Israel being a genocidal apartheid country, even though it contradicts their opposition to Hamas and Iran. Now, I'm trying to figure out, through the lens of the pro-Israel people who conducted this survey and wrote up these talking points, what they actually meant by this last sentence, because this is confusing to me. So basically they're saying that the survey said people were generally against Hamas and they were against Iran, but they simultaneously said Israel is a genocidal apartheid country. And it seems like these survey, conductors are confused about that, right? They're saying even though it contradicts with their opposition to Hamas and Iran, they say Israel is a genocidal apartheid country. Well, these aren't contradictory things. Like, you can be anti-Hamas or anti-Iran if you want, and also be anti-Israel. you can be, dislike the Iranian government or dislike Hamas's leadership in Gaza and also understand the nature of Israeli apartheid and that what they're doing in Gaza is a genocide. Like, these are not contradictory terms here, but it seems like, I guess their lens of analysis here is like, you're either team Israel or you're team Hamas and Iran. And so there's no way that you could possibly have critiques of both sides of the equation here. I'm still trying to work out exactly what they mean by this. But the key point here is that in their own survey, a survey commissioned by the Israeli government and conducted by, pro-Israel Americans, a pro-Israel American organization, they're admitting that Europeans and Americans generally agree with the language that Israel is a genocidal apartheid country. So they're trying to figure out, how do we combat this from this point? But this is a remarkable starting point, right? If you think of, especially here in the US, and I can't speak to this necessarily in Europe because I'm not as familiar with it, but with the overwhelming pro-Israel propaganda that we have had subjected to us over the last 2 years of this genocide, right? I mean, full-blown support from both political parties in this country, genocidal support, both from a Democratic president under Biden and now a Republican president under Donald Trump, continued support for sending weapons to Israel, continued support for giving them cover on the international stage and sanctioning the International Criminal Court and going after the International Court of Justice. Like, the uniform support from both the American media and the American government. And even with all of that support for Israel, even with all of that genocide denialism, even with all of that, Israeli government talking points that we are subjected to on a daily basis, the American people, and it seems like Europeans broadly, still come to the conclusion, right, that Israel is a genocidal apartheid state, which is true again, right? So it shows you that, maybe there are other avenues that people are getting their information from. Maybe people are even more distrusting of mainstream outlets. Maybe they're more distrusting of government talking points than they were even before this genocide began, which was already reaching, kind of historic levels, at least here in the United States. And it shows that people, to at least some extent, can overcome a lot of that Hasbara propaganda that they've been subjected to. And it's not difficult to figure out like how we ended up at that point, especially when you see where young people are at on this issue. Like, when you're scrolling your timeline and every single day you're seeing, dead children being pulled from the rubble of a blown out apartment building or a refugee camp that's on fire, and you can see the silhouette of children being burned alive in the background, like, it's not difficult to see how you go from daily images like that to saying, hey, maybe this is fucked up what this country is doing with our weapons, with our support. And so again, they're desperate to figure out, how do we fix this situation? And it seems like the main thing they've come to is, let's just make everybody really Islamophobic. And maybe that will overcome their criticism of our genocide, right? So just to give you one example of this, and I actually saw this float across my timeline, I think a couple weeks ago. Yeah, this is from August 25th. And I bookmarked it because I didn't really know where exactly to slot it into a video because it was just so insane to me. But this is a perfect chance for that, because it ties in to exactly the kind of messaging that clearly Israel is trying to go with here. So this is from the official verified Israel Arabic Twitter account, right? And this is a translated portion of what they tweeted. You can see the graphic down here. They say, in the year 1980, there were only fewer than 100 mosques in Europe. As for today, there are more than 20,000 mosques. This is the true face of colonization. And this is what is happening while Europe is oblivious and does not care about the danger. They say that danger does not lie in the existence of mosques and in and of themselves, for freedom in worship is one of the most basic human rights, and every person has the right to believe and worship his Lord. The problem lies in the contents that they are taught in these mosques, and they are not limited to piety and good deeds, but rather focus on encouraging escalating violence in the streets of Europe and spreading hatred for the other, and even those who host them in their countries, and inciting against them, and instead of teaching love, harmony, and peace. Europe must wake up and remove this fifth column. So they try to slot in here in the middle, like, well, we're not trying to say like you should be against mosques in general. Like, Muslims aren't all bad, right? There are like some good ones, but you should be really afraid of these mosques, right? You should be terrified of the existence of Muslims in your country. Be afraid of these mosques because you don't know what they're teaching inside these mosques, right? They could be teaching them to go and enact violence in the streets and to kidnap your children or whatever the case may be. right? That's the messaging that they're going with here. I mean, I read this and I had to double check that this was from the official Israeli Arabic account, because it is such unabashed Islamophobia, such unabashed racism here, to literally say the increase of the existence of a religious place of worship like a mosque is in and of itself a threat to you. And so you should become more Islamophobic, because maybe, and this is the true goal based on what we just read from this drop site report, from their own messaging strategies, the goal of this kind of a talking point is to say, please be more Islamophobic, because if you're more Islamophobic, maybe you can help us dehumanize Palestinians to the point where we can get away with this genocide. That's how disgusting this kind of messaging is. That's the intent. That's the purpose of this kind of messaging. So, be on the lookout for this kind of shit, because it's only going to increase. And to give you a perspective, to finishing off this video here on how much of an increase of this we're about to see, here we have again from Dropsite, Jack Polson and Lee Fong. Their headline is Google's $45 million contract with Netanyahu's office to spread Israeli propaganda. So what are they talking about here? They say on March 2nd, 2025, hours after the Israeli government announced the blockade of all food, medicine, fuel, and other humanitarian supplies from entering Gaza, lawmakers in Jerusalem demanded answers, not on the devastating human toll of such a decision, but on how the prime minister was preparing to handle the public relations fallout. Incredible, right? He's saying we're going to cut off the food, the fuel, the water, the electricity, the medicine, etc. And the concerns from the Israeli government officials is not, hey, that's going to be disastrous in a humanitarian sense. The concern from them is, how are we going to justify this so that the world doesn't get angry with us, right? They say publicly available government contracts show that Israel's advertising bureau, which reports to the prime minister's office, has since embarked on a mass advertising and public messaging effort to conceal the hunger crisis. The push includes the use of American influencers, widely reported on last month. It also includes a high-dollar spending spree on paid advertising, yielding tens of millions for Google, YouTube, X, Meta, and other tech platforms. All of these companies profiting off of genocide denialism. All of them. They say there is food in Gaza. Any other claim is a lie, asserted a propaganda video published by Israel's foreign ministry to Google's YouTube video sharing platform in late August and viewed more than 6 million times. Much of the video's reach results from an ad placed during an ongoing and previously unreported $45 million advertising campaign initiated between Google and Netanyahu's office in late June. The contract, which is both YouTube and Google's advertising campaign messaging platform, Display and Video 360, explicitly characterizes the ad campaign as hasbara, a Hebrew word whose meaning is somewhere between public relations and propaganda. So Google, YouTube in this instance, and maybe this is part of the reason me covering this stuff, why my videos get demonetized and censored so often, but YouTube, the platform that I'm on right now, is working in coordination with Benjamin Netanyahu, with the Israeli government, to do ad campaigns that are explicitly or genocide denial propaganda, right? I mean, they say there is food in Gaza. Any other claim is a lie, denying the starvation that is happening inside of Gaza as dozens and dozens of people continue to starve to death. And you can see here, as they pointed out here, the views versus the like ratio, right? So typically on my video, just as a comparison here, let's say I have a video that gets like 10,000 views on it, right? On a video with 10,000 views on my channel, it'll probably have anywhere between like 400 to maybe over 600 likes on it, right? That's sort of the relative ratio between likes and views. This video has 6 million views and only 188 likes. So this tells you that none of this is organic. This is entirely as a result of an external advertising campaign that's being pushed on all these social media platforms. So they say records show that the Israeli government similarly spent $3 million for an advertising campaign with X, and I can confirm that because my Twitter feed, goes from seeing, again, images of children being pulled from the rubble, emaciated children who are starving in Gaza and reports of people starving to death, to then right under that being an Israeli government-sponsored advertisement denying that all of that is happening, right? They say the French and Israeli advertising platform, Outbrain and Teads, is also set to relieve $2.1 million for a campaign. They say the ads have aired in response to increasing global outcry over the deteriorating situation in Gaza, where, as we reported on this channel, in August, the UN formally declared a famine in the Gaza governorate, which includes Gaza City, the place where Israel is increasing their attacks right now. They also say that the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or the IPC, the leading global authority on food security, projected the threshold for famine would be crossed in Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis in the coming weeks, stating that this famine is entirely man-made. It can be halted and reversed. And the UN Aid Coordination Office, the OCHA, further warned on Friday of a descent into a massive famine in the Gaza Strip. And of course, they point out here that 367 at least Palestinians, including over 131 children, have died as a result of hunger and malnutrition. So this is what Israel is dealing with, and they're trying to figure out, how do we prevent people from knowing that? How do we tell them that that's all a big fat lie, right? A couple more things here. They say other Israeli government ads on Google's platform accuse the United Nations of deliberate sabotage of aid delivery into Gaza, right? Israel is not doing the deliberate sabotage. They're not blocking the aid from getting in. It's the United Nations that's sabotaging aid delivery. I mean, what are we doing at this point? Does anybody believe this shit? Who is this for? Right? They also promoted the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or the GHF, which is backed by Israel, the US, and unnamed European countries, and of course is essentially functioning right now as a mercenary organization that is assisting in Israel's plot to push the population southward to eventually force the entire population out of Gaza and into concentration camps. They also say that one campaign promoted prosecution of the militant group Hamas, which governs Gaza, for debunked allegations of mass sexual violence as a result of a report published by the Israeli advocacy group Dana Project. They say, despite the denial about the famine, and this is where it's incredible in terms of how we cover what not only is happening on the ground, but also what is said by Israeli government officials who tend to just say the quiet part out loud. So they say, again, despite the denial of famine that they're running in these ad campaigns, prominent Israeli government voices have championed the effort to cut off food and water to Gazans as a strategy for inducing mass migration out of the territory. Quote, "In my opinion, you can besiege them," said Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister and a coalition partner to Netanyahu's government. He said, "No water, no electricity. They can die of hunger or surrender." We also had Amichai Eliyahu, the Knesset member who leads the Heritage Ministry in Netanyahu's government, who similarly called for starving the Palestinian population in Gaza, saying, quote, "There is no nation that feeds its enemies." She said in May, the minister argued that Palestinians need to starve, and added, if there are civilians who fear for their lives, they should go through the emigration plan. So, again, this is one of the strangest parts about what I've experienced covering this genocide for 2 years now, is that you'll see the denial from the Israeli government, officially at least. You'll see the denial from the US government. You will see the propaganda carried then by the US media overwhelmingly. And then I go and I look at not only what is Israel actually doing on the ground, what are Palestinian journalists on the ground, what are the reports from Gaza actually saying, but then I also just look at Israeli government officials and what they say to their own population. And you get shit like this. No water, no food. They can die of hunger or surrender. If there are civilians who fear for their lives, they should go through the emigration plan. So they don't hide this shit, guys. Like, it's not like you have to spend a lot of time reading through the lines and doing, this deep analysis to try to figure out what their goal is, what their plan is. Because you have dozens of Israeli Knesset members, of Israeli military officials, of Israeli government officials who just openly say shit like this, who say stuff like, you can either starve or you can leave, right? Openly saying, I'm in favor of using starvation, of using food and hunger as a weapon of war in order to try to force the population out, to ethnically cleanse them. They openly say this shit, right? And this kind of stuff is what's not reported in the US media, right? And so this is probably why in polling data like we saw in this first report, that people have a somewhat warped view of what Israel is doing, right? It's not a mystery as to why a bulk of the US and European populations wouldn't know the real estimated death toll in Gaza, or wouldn't know the real goals of the Israeli government, that it's not to, target Hamas or whatever the case may be. It's the full ethnic cleansing of Gaza, right? It is to make Gaza unlivable. And so, interesting to see these kinds of statements continuing as we compare that to where the world is at right now. And by the way, these were polls of like the United States and European countries. The rest of the world is overwhelmingly anti-Israel at this point. Like, you go look at polls from the rest of the world outside of Europe and the US, and it's even more of a stark contrast. Now, last thing here, speaking of the continued death and carnage inside of Gaza, they are significantly escalating their invasion of Gaza City, killing people as they try to flee, killing people that are in tent encampments, trying to take refuge in high-rise apartments. You can see right here, this was the Mushtaha Tower in West Gaza City that was being hit by an Israeli airstrike just earlier today, and you can see the massive plume of smoke, a huge airstrike that hit it down here at the bottom. And the entire building collapsed. This was reportedly a building that was being used to house displaced people and wounded people. And so, of course, they're trying to demolish it. This is an effort to basically flatten everything in Gaza City to the ground, such that there is nowhere that Palestinians can remain, so that they are forced to flee to the south to eventually, be housed in concentration camps and then eventually expelled. Now, a couple things in terms of what's been happening just over the last day or so. They say the Israeli military launched intensified attacks on Gaza on Friday, killing at least 44 people, including 7 children, in attacks on Gaza City. They say Gaza's Ministry of Health reports at least 69 Palestinians killed and 422 injured in the past 24 hours. They say 6 Palestinians were killed and 190 injured while seeking aid. And at this point, the total recorded death toll since October 7th is now 64,000, again, an undercount, with 162,000 injured. They say 3 more deaths were recorded over the past 24 hours due to starvation and malnutrition, bringing that total to 376, including now 134 children. So I'll leave you guys off with that. Again, credit to Dropsite News for the incredible reporting that they do on Gaza. It's free to sign up for their email list or whatever. Highly recommend you guys do that. I read almost every single report that they put out on Israel and Gaza, and thanks to their reporting, we get information like this. I mean, it's very clear at this point that as Israel intensifies their genocide, as it becomes clearer and clearer to the rest of the world, that their plan here is the annihilation of the people of Gaza, that their plan is to ethnically cleanse them into surrounding countries or around the world. It's becoming increasingly clear that the world understands this, right? And so Israel is panicking, and they're trying to run these surveys, these tests, to figure out how can we possibly salvage our reputation. And it seems like what they've come down with is, let's try to turn everybody into the biggest Islamophobes that history has ever seen. Because if they're Islamophobic enough, then maybe they will again be able to internally dehumanize Palestinians to such an extent that they can overlook this genocide. And our goal, my goal, our job, my job, is to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying